Hello, everyone. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, close your eyes and let's begin the first story. The autumn evening air carried a crisp coolness as my cousin Elle and I began our journey toward Greensboro, North Carolina. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, eager to visit my boyfriend Chris during his fall break. Elle, my second cousin, who felt more like a sister to me, had graciously offered to take me along on her trucking route. As we settled into the comfortable cab of her big rig, the familiar hum of the diesel engine created a rhythmic backdrop to our conversation. The sun had already begun its descent toward the horizon when we started talking about our various paranormal experiences. Elle reminded me of her encounter with the ghost hitchhiker, that mysterious lady in white who had vanished from her truck just as suddenly as she had appeared. The memory still sent shivers down her spine, though she admitted the adrenaline rush had been oddly exhilarating. Our conversation naturally drifted toward other supernatural topics, and I found myself enthusiastically discussing cryptids, wendigos, and skinwalkers with the passion of someone who had spent countless hours researching such phenomena. Elle laughed off my enthusiasm with good-natured skepticism. She had been a firm disbeliever in such things until her ghostly encounter, but creatures like wendigos still seemed too far-fetched for her practical mind. With a playful grin, she made a bet that would soon come back to haunt us both. "The day I see a wendigo or skinwalker," she declared with confidence, "is the day I give you $100. Her laughter filled the cab as she continued to express her doubts, while I huffed with mild annoyance, though I couldn't really blame her for her skepticism. About an hour and a half into our drive, we found ourselves traveling through an area where thick woods stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway. The landscape felt ancient and untouched, with towering trees that seemed to whisper secrets in the evening breeze. As if summoned by our earlier conversation, a dense fog began to roll in from the forest itself, creating ethereal swirls that danced in our headlights. I became mesmerized by the intricate patterns the mist created, watching as it seemed to flow with purpose rather than drift randomly. Elle's demeanor suddenly shifted as the fog thickened around us. Her hands gripped the steering wheel with increased tension, and her usual cheerful chatter ceased entirely. "All right, Mel," she said, using my nickname with unusual seriousness. "I need to focus now. This fog is really thick." I understood immediately and settled back into my seat, letting her concentrate on navigating the increasingly treacherous road conditions. The fog seemed to press against our windows like ghostly fingers, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made even the familiar cab feel isolated from the rest of the world. To pass the time and calm my nerves, I put in my headphones and began listening to stories about Native American folklore creatures. The tales of ancient spirits and shapeshifters seemed particularly appropriate given our surroundings, though I had no idea how prophetic my choice of entertainment would prove to be. I was just beginning to relax when Elle's scream shattered the peaceful atmosphere, followed by a string of colorful language that would have made a sailor blush. The entire cab shook violently, as did the trailer behind us, creating a jarring symphony of metal and machinery. Not wanting to frighten me further, Elle quickly explained that we had hit what she assumed was a large pothole. She assured me there was nothing to worry about, though I could sense the uncertainty in her voice. Something about the way the truck had shaken didn't feel like a simple road hazard, but I trusted her experience and tried to push my concerns aside. I rolled down my window to let in the cool night air, hoping to clear my head and enjoy the sounds of nocturnal wildlife that usually brought me such peace. The gentle hooting of owls and rustling of small creatures in the underbrush created a soothing, natural symphony that helped calm my nerves. I closed my eyes and let the forest sounds wash over me, imagining the various animals going about their nightly routines in the darkness beyond our headlights. It was during this moment of relative tranquility that our night took a decidedly darker turn. A mile or two up the road, one of Elle's tires began losing air pressure with an ominous hissing sound that cut through the night air. She cursed under her breath and carefully guided the heavy truck to the side of the road, the vehicle listing slightly as the damaged tire struggled to support its share of the weight. In the growing darkness, with fog still swirling around us like something from a horror movie, we found ourselves stranded in the middle of nowhere with nothing but endless forest stretching in every direction. Elle's confession came reluctantly, her voice heavy with guilt and concern. "Mel, I gotta tell you, that wasn't a pothole a couple miles back. I think I ran over a buck, and if it was a buck, it was in terrible shape." Her words hung in the air between us, carrying implications that neither of us wanted to fully acknowledge. She explained that she hadn't wanted to tell me initially, because she knew how much I loved animals. But the condition of whatever we had struck had been so disturbing that she felt compelled to investigate and move it off the road to prevent other drivers from experiencing the same shocking encounter. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. Interstate 4 in Florida earned its reputation as one of the most enigmatic stretches of highway in the southeastern United States, and my best friend Grant was about to discover why firsthand. The year was 2009, and Grant had just obtained his driver's license, filled with the excitement and confidence that comes with newfound freedom. He had planned an ambitious road trip down to the south, eager to explore new territories and prove his independence to himself and others who had questioned his adventurous spirit. As Grant made his way through Florida, several fellow motorists took the time to warn him about a particular section of interstate. For that, locals referred to with a mixture of fear and fascination as the dead zone. This mysterious stretch of highway was apparently host to a bewildering array of unexplained phenomena that defied rational explanation, from sudden engine malfunctions in perfectly maintained vehicles to complete loss of cell phone signals in areas that should have had excellent coverage. The dead zone seemed to operate by its own supernatural rules. The warnings came from truckers at rest stops, gas station attendants, and even other travelers who had experienced the strange occurrences firsthand. They spoke of drivers who suddenly encountered people offering assistance, only to have these helpful strangers vanish without a trace moments later. Some reported seeing the same person multiple times along the route, despite the impossibility of anyone traveling faster than their vehicles. Others described feeling an overwhelming sense of being watched by unseen eyes that followed their progress along the highway. Grant listened to these tales with the healthy skepticism of youth, dismissing them as nothing more than elaborate urban legends designed to frighten outsiders. He had always been a practical person who believed in logical explanations for seemingly mysterious events. In his mind, the so-called gravity hills were simply optical illusions created by the rolling terrain. and the stories of supernatural encounters were just the products of overactive imaginations and local folklore passed down through generations of residents who enjoyed perpetuating these myths. However, Grant's confidence in rational explanations began to waver as he entered the infamous dead zone and started experiencing the strange phenomena for himself. His car, which had been running perfectly throughout the entire journey, suddenly developed mysterious problems that seemed to come and go without any mechanical reason. The engine light began flashing erratically, turning on and off in a pattern that defied any logical diagnosis, especially considering his vehicle had just passed a comprehensive inspection before the trip. The radio, which had been providing clear reception throughout Florida, began picking up nothing but static interference, despite being in an area where multiple strong stations should have been broadcasting. Grant tried adjusting the antenna and scanning different frequencies, but nothing seemed to help. The static had an almost intentional quality to it, as if something was deliberately jamming the signals to isolate him from the outside world. Concerned about his vehicle's apparent mechanical issues, Grant decided to pull over and investigate under the hood. As he lifted the car's hood and began examining the engine components, looking for any obvious signs of trouble, a car suddenly appeared and pulled up beside him. A young woman emerged from the vehicle, introducing herself with the surname Sana, and politely offered her assistance with whatever automotive problems he might be experiencing. Grant, maintaining his independence and masculine pride, politely declined her offer of help, explaining that he was confident he could handle the situation himself. However, his rejection of her assistance seemed to trigger an unexpected and unsettling reaction. The woman's demeanor changed dramatically, her friendly expression transforming into something much darker and more menacing. She began to glare at him with an intensity that made him deeply uncomfortable, her eyes holding a cold anger that seemed disproportionate to his simple refusal of help. Without another word, the mysterious woman returned to her vehicle and sped away with such velocity that her tires squealed against the asphalt, leaving Grant standing alone beside his car, bewildered by the strange encounter. The intensity of her reaction to his polite refusal left him feeling unsettled and confused about what had just transpired. Before long, another motorist stopped to offer assistance, and Grant, still puzzled by his previous encounter, decided to ask about the woman who had just departed. "By the way," he inquired, "did you see that woman driving the Camry who was just here?" The man looked back at Grant with genuine confusion and concern, as if Grant had just asked about something that couldn't possibly exist. "What are you talking about?" the stranger replied with obvious bewilderment. "I was just behind you the whole time, and no one was ahead of us on this stretch of road. Let's dive into the next disturbing story." Two of my older sisters had built their careers around providing compassionate in-home care for elderly clients, a demanding but rewarding profession that required dedication and genuine concern for others' well-being. My oldest sister, whom I'll call Sarah to protect her privacy, worked the evening shift that typically ended around 8 o'clock in the evening. At that precise time, my other sister Claire would arrive to take over the overnight responsibilities, ensuring their elderly client received continuous care and supervision throughout the night hours. On this particular evening, Sarah had lingered longer than usual, engaging in pleasant conversation with Claire after her shift had officially ended. The two sisters enjoyed these brief moments together, sharing stories about their day and catching up on family news. Time seemed to slip away unnoticed as they chatted, and before they realized it, The clock had struck 10:30 in the evening. Sarah finally said her goodbyes and prepared to head home to her family, though she harbored concerns about her aging vehicle's reliability. As she prepared to leave, Sarah asked Claire to call her husband and inform him of her departure time. Her car had been experiencing mechanical issues lately, making strange noises and occasionally stuttering during acceleration, and she was genuinely worried it might break down during her journey home. The route between her workplace and her residence required traveling along a relatively isolated stretch of interstate, and the thought of being stranded alone in the darkness was deeply concerning. Unfortunately, her husband and their children had decided to spend the night camping in their backyard, setting up a tent and planning to sleep under the stars as a fun family adventure. With everyone outside and settled in for the night, nobody was inside the house to answer the telephone when Claire attempted to make the requested call. By the time Sarah's vehicle predictably broke down on the interstate, her family members were already fast asleep in their tent, completely unaware of her predicament. Sarah sat in her disabled vehicle, trying to maintain her composure, while fighting off waves of panic that threatened to overwhelm her rational thinking. She had no cell phone available, as this was during an era when mobile devices were not yet commonplace or affordable for everyone. She felt confident that Claire had successfully reached her husband, and that he would soon realize she was overdue and come searching for her along the familiar route between her workplace and home. As the minutes stretched into an hour or more, Sarah's initial confidence began to erode, replaced by growing concern and anxiety. She lived only about 30 minutes away from her workplace, so if her husband was indeed coming to rescue her, he should have arrived by now. The empty highway stretched endlessly in both directions, with no signs of approaching headlights or any indication that help was on the way. It was during this moment of increasing desperation that she noticed the distinctive rumble of an 18-wheeler approaching from behind. The massive truck pulled up in front of her disabled car, its air brakes hissing as it came to a complete stop. The driver emerged from his cab and walked over to her vehicle, his heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet night air as he approached her driver's side window. Sarah cautiously cracked her window just enough to facilitate conversation, while maintaining a barrier between herself and this unknown stranger. The trucker inquired about her situation, asking if she was experiencing any difficulties or needed assistance. She replied that she was fine and that her husband would be arriving shortly to help her, hoping to discourage any unwanted attention or intervention from this unexpected visitor. The driver smiled in what seemed like a friendly manner and explained that he had noticed her stranded vehicle during his earlier pass through the area, while making a delivery to the town where she worked. He had made a mental note to check on the situation during his return trip, and true to his word, he had stopped to offer assistance. This explanation put Sarah somewhat at ease, as it suggested he was simply a good Samaritan rather than someone with malicious intentions. However, the trucker insisted that he couldn't simply leave her stranded on the dark highway, as doing so would weigh heavily on his conscience and cause him to worry about her safety for the remainder of his journey. He explained that while he didn't have access to a telephone, he would be happy to transport her to a 24-hour gas station at the next exit, where she could use their phone to contact someone for help and wait in a safe, well-lit environment. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. I've been driving trucks for approximately 2 years now, though my connection to the trucking industry extends much deeper into my personal history. Growing up, I was surrounded by the culture and traditions of long-haul trucking, absorbing stories and wisdom from family members and family friends who had spent their careers navigating America's highways and byways. This early exposure gave me a profound appreciation for both the romance and the harsh realities of life on the road. One of my greatest pleasures during downtime at truck stops and rest areas is engaging in conversations with the old-timers, those weathered veterans who experienced trucking during what many consider its golden age. These conversations provide fascinating glimpses into an era when the industry operated under different rules and regulations, when drivers had more autonomy and the highways felt less congested and more adventurous. Through these discussions, I've learned about the good times, the challenging periods, and perhaps most intriguingly, the rich tapestry of superstitions that permeate trucking culture. Every driver I've encountered, regardless of which company they work for, what routes they travel, or how many years they've spent behind the wheel, has witnessed their fair share of inexplicable phenomena. The nature of the profession naturally exposes drivers to unusual situations and encounters. I've personally witnessed devastating multi-vehicle accidents during harsh winter conditions, dangerous vehicle fires during scorching summer months, and I've unfortunately arrived at accident scenes before emergency responders on more than one occasion. These experiences are simply part of the job's reality. The more time you spend traveling America's highways, the greater the likelihood of encountering unpleasant, dangerous, or tragic situations. However, there's one particular incident that continues to haunt me during those long, lonely nights when the highway stretches endlessly ahead and my mind has too much time to wander into dark territories. To properly explain this experience, I need to provide some background context, even though it might make this account somewhat lengthy. I began my trucking career at the end of the pandemic, after being laid off from a factory job where I had worked for 5 years, with no clear indication of when the factory might reopen and resume normal operations. I began exploring alternative career paths that might provide stability and steady income. I decided that if truckers had continued working throughout the pandemic, maintaining essential supply chains and keeping the economy functioning, then trucking would likely provide job security through almost any future crisis or economic downturn. This practical consideration led me to enroll in a small, local driving school where I obtained my commercial driver's license and subsequently found employment with a reputable company. After approximately 1 year of gaining experience and building my reputation as a reliable driver, my longtime friend expressed serious interest in joining the trucking industry. I spoke enthusiastically about the profession and helped him connect with a company that provided comprehensive training programs and would place him on the road with an experienced mentor. For the purposes of this story, I'll refer to this friend simply as Sam to protect his privacy. Sam was several years older than myself and had been serving in the National Guard Reserve, bringing military discipline and experience to his new civilian career. He was actively seeking employment between deployments, as he had recently injured his knee during a training operation and was in the process of switching his enlisted job classification. While navigating the complex military bureaucracy and waiting for paperwork to be processed, he decided that truck driving would provide good interim employment. Our career paths took us in different directions across the country. I was assigned to flatbed operations, primarily in the northeastern United States, hauling construction materials, steel, and industrial equipment. Sam, meanwhile, was driving box trailers for a major national carrier, with routes that typically ran between Pennsylvania and various destinations throughout the western states. He even sent me photographs from the world's largest truck stop, located along Route 80 in Iowa, which had become something of a pilgrimage destination for professional drivers. Although we rarely crossed paths during our respective journeys across the continent, we occasionally found ourselves back in our hometown during periods of home time. During these brief reunions, we would meet up at local establishments, enjoy a few drinks together, and exchange stories about our adventures and experiences on the road. These conversations became treasured opportunities to maintain our friendship despite our demanding schedules. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. When I was 19 years old, I spent considerable time driving a semi-truck with my father serving as my team driver, an arrangement that provided both practical training and valuable bonding time. We worked for a small, family-oriented trucking company that specialized in regional routes throughout the northeastern United States. The company's modest size meant we often received personalized attention and developed close relationships with dispatchers and management, creating a supportive work environment that felt more like an extended family than a corporate hierarchy. My story takes place in a small Minnesota town where we had just completed a delivery, dropping our trailer at its designated destination and preparing for our next assignment. While waiting for dispatch to contact us with information about our subsequent load, we decided to visit a local restaurant that conveniently offered truck parking. This establishment had become a familiar and comfortable stopping point during our travels through the region, providing both good food and a safe place to rest while conducting business. The restaurant's parking area had enough space to accommodate approximately 10 trucks, creating a small community of drivers who would often gather to share stories and compare notes about road conditions, fuel prices, and various aspects of the trucking lifestyle. We maneuvered our rig between two other trucks, positioning ourselves in what appeared to be a secure and convenient location that would allow easy exit when we received our next assignment. My father headed into the restaurant to secure a table for us, while I took responsibility for letting my dog out for her necessary bathroom break. My canine companion was a small Shih Tzu who had adapted well to life on the road, providing companionship and emotional support during long hours of travel. Despite her diminutive size, she had earned her place as an integral member of our trucking team, always sleeping on the top bunk with me and requiring minimal space or resources. I bundled up in my coat against the cold weather, then carefully dressed my dog in her own protective harness and coat before carrying her out of the truck. The parking lot was illuminated by a single, somewhat dim street lamp that cast long shadows and created pockets of darkness between the parked vehicles. Despite the less than ideal lighting conditions, I felt comfortable in this familiar environment where we had stopped numerous times without incident. My routine at this restaurant had become well established through repetition. I would walk my dog around behind the parked trucks where she could conduct her business in relative privacy, then complete our walk by circling around to the front of the trucks before returning to our vehicle. This pattern allowed her adequate exercise while keeping us both safe from traffic on the adjacent roadway. As I placed her on the ground and began our familiar routine, I noticed a dirt mound behind the trucks that had been created by snowplows clearing the unpaved parking lot throughout the winter months. This mound had developed a convenient gap between our truck and the neighboring vehicle, creating a natural pathway that provided access to the area behind the parked trucks where my dog preferred to relieve herself. We used this gap to access the rear area, where she quickly attended to her initial needs, before I guided her toward the front of the trucks to complete our routine walk. As we rounded the front corner of the vehicles, she stopped again to take care of additional business, and I dutifully cleaned up after her using waste bags that I always carried for this purpose. After tying off the waste bag and preparing to return to our truck, I noticed that my dog had remained stationary instead of following me as she normally would. I attempted to coax her forward using encouraging words and gentle gestures, but she refused to budge from her position. Initially, I assumed her small paws had simply gotten too cold from contact with the frozen ground, a common problem during winter months that was easily solved by carrying her. I picked up my small companion and began carrying her toward our truck, speaking to her in the gentle, reassuring tone I always used when she seemed uncomfortable or anxious. "What's gotten into you?" I asked, as she squirmed and grumbled in my arms, displaying unusual restlessness that was quite different from her normal calm demeanor during our routine walks. Due to her small size, I was easily able to maintain control of her fidgeting until we reached the gap between trucks, where we needed to pass through to reach our vehicle. However, at that precise moment, she jumped out of my arms with surprising determination and landed near the door of our semi-truck. Concerned that the fall might have injured her despite the short distance, I quickly turned to check on her condition. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. My second cousin is a professional truck driver who grew up in the small town of Grimslin, North Carolina, and she and I developed a relationship that felt more like sisterhood than the typical distant connection between cousins. We were approximately the same age, which allowed us to relate to each other's experiences and challenges in ways that transcended the usual family dynamics. She embodied the classic tomboy archetype, comfortable with mechanical work and outdoor activities, while I had initially embraced a more traditionally feminine, prissy aesthetic, before eventually adopting the Gothic style that better reflected my true personality. Our contrasting personalities extended to our beliefs about paranormal phenomena. I had always been naturally open to supernatural explanations and otherworldly possibilities, while she maintained a more skeptical, practical worldview that demanded concrete evidence before accepting unusual claims. However, she never completely dismissed the existence of paranormal activity, maintaining just enough open-mindedness to consider alternative explanations when presented with compelling experiences. I must admit that my openness to the supernatural may have occasionally crossed the line into recklessness. Through various experiments and explorations of metaphysical concepts, I may have inadvertently opened doors and portals that were better left undisturbed. My curiosity about the unknown sometimes led me to engage with forces and energies that I didn't fully understand or properly respect. One rainy night, while my cousin was driving through US Route 70 in Greensboro, North Carolina, her perspective on supernatural phenomena would undergo a dramatic transformation. The encounter she experienced that evening shook her fundamental beliefs so profoundly that she felt compelled to call and share the story with me immediately after reaching her destination. She had been navigating the dark highway with only a cup of coffee for company during the long, solitary drive that stretched ahead of her. The road appeared virtually empty at that late hour of the night, which she typically enjoyed since it allowed her to focus on her thoughts and listen to music without the stress of heavy traffic. The gentle sound of rain against her windshield was creating a soothing, rhythmic backdrop that was beginning to make her feel drowsy despite the caffeine she had consumed. Suddenly, her fatigue vanished as she became fully alert, noticing something unusual ahead on the roadway. There was someone standing on the side of the road, and as she drew closer, she could see it was a young lady wearing an elegant white evening dress that seemed completely inappropriate for the stormy weather conditions. The woman was desperately attempting to flag down her truck, waving her arms in obvious distress and need. My cousin found herself wondering what circumstances could possibly have led to a lady dressed so formally being stranded alone on this desolate stretch of highway during such terrible weather. The situation seemed so unusual and potentially dangerous that she couldn't simply drive past without offering assistance. After all, the road was completely deserted at this time of night, and she might be this woman's only hope for help. She pulled her truck over to the side of the road and opened her door, motioning for the young lady to climb up into the cab where she would be safe from the rain and wind. The woman accepted the invitation and settled into the passenger seat, introducing herself with a soft voice as Lydia. She explained that she had just been attending a dance and was now simply trying to get home, providing my cousin with an address for her destination. My cousin examined the address and entered it into her GPS navigation system, discovering that the location wasn't too far from their current position. She attempted to engage Lydia in conversation, asking natural questions about where the dance had been held and how she had ended up stranded alongside the highway in such formal attire during a storm. However, Lydia remained completely silent, not responding to any of the questions or attempts at friendly conversation. My cousin initially attributed this unusual behavior to fatigue, assuming that all the dancing had worn her out and that she was simply too tired to engage in small talk. She offered to share her name and encouraged Lydia to rest if she needed to, trying to create a comfortable atmosphere for her unexpected passenger. When they finally reached the designated destination, my cousin turned around to retrieve a flashlight from the storage area behind her seat, intending to provide Lydia with illumination so she could safely navigate to her front door in the darkness and rain. However, when she turned back around to offer the flashlight and wish her passenger a pleasant evening, she discovered that Lydia had completely vanished from the truck. The disappearance had occurred in the span of only 5 to 8 seconds, barely enough time for someone to open the door and exit the vehicle, let alone disappear completely from sight. My cousin felt a chill run down her spine as she sat alone in her truck, trying to process what had just happened and searching for any logical explanation for Lydia's impossible disappearance. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. A few years ago, I found myself at a crossroads in my life and decided that becoming a truck driver would provide the change of pace and new perspective I desperately needed while I figured out my long-term career goals. The trucking industry offered the promise of travel, independence, and decent pay, while I took time to explore my options and determine what direction I wanted my life to take. After obtaining my commercial driver's license and completing approximately 6 months of over-the-road experience, I was beginning to feel comfortable with the rhythms and demands of professional driving. On this particular night, I was making my way back to my home terminal, and everything seemed to be proceeding smoothly with my schedule. I was actually running ahead of my projected arrival time by about 30 minutes, which always felt like a small victory in an industry where timing and efficiency were paramount. The digital clock on my dashboard read 3 o'clock in the morning, and I had just finished brewing a fresh pot of coffee using the portable coffee maker that had become an essential piece of equipment for maintaining alertness during long nighttime drives. At this early hour, the highway was virtually empty of other traffic, a condition that I had grown to appreciate, since it allowed me to focus on my driving without the constant stress of navigating around other vehicles. Metallic was playing on my radio, providing an energetic soundtrack that helped keep me alert and engaged during these solitary hours on the road. I took a careful sip of the scalding hot coffee, savoring both the warmth and the caffeine boost that would help carry me through the remainder of my journey home. Suddenly, my attention was captured by headlights appearing approximately 500 yards ahead of me in the distance. Initially, I didn't pay much attention to the approaching vehicle, as encountering other traffic was certainly not unusual even during these quiet nighttime hours. However, something about this particular vehicle's behavior began to concern me as it drew closer. When the car was only about 2 seconds away from passing me in the opposite direction, it suddenly and inexplicably swerved directly into my lane at full speed, creating an imminent collision situation that required immediate defensive action. I instinctively slammed on my brakes as hard as possible, feeling the massive weight of my truck fighting against the sudden deceleration, as I tried desperately to avoid what appeared to be an inevitable and potentially fatal accident. The moment the oncoming car should have impacted my truck, everything around me went completely dark. My headlights, dashboard lights, and all electrical systems simultaneously failed, plunging me into absolute darkness. Even the engine died completely, leaving me coasting in an eerie silence that was broken only by the screech of my tires against the asphalt as the truck gradually came to a grinding halt. Remarkably, despite the violent nature of the emergency stop and the massive momentum involved, my truck remained upright and didn't roll over, which could easily have been a fatal outcome given the circumstances. I sat in stunned silence for several moments, trying to process what had just occurred and wondering if I had somehow managed to avoid the collision through quick reflexes and good fortune. I quickly exited my truck, flashlight in hand, expecting to find evidence of an accident or at least some indication of what had happened to the other vehicle. I carefully examined my truck from multiple angles, looking for any signs of impact damage, but found no dents, scratches, or other evidence that a collision had occurred. There was no debris on the roadway, no skid marks from another vehicle, and no sign whatsoever of the car that had seemed destined to crash into me. Confused and increasingly concerned about my sanity, I walked around the immediate area, searching for any clues that might explain what I had experienced. I told myself that the other car must have somehow missed me by mere inches, though I couldn't understand how such a close call could have occurred without leaving any physical evidence or causing any damage to either vehicle. Eventually, I returned to my truck and attempted to restart the engine, but nothing happened when I turned the key. The electrical system appeared to be completely dead, as if the battery had been drained of all power instantaneously. I retrieved my cell phone to call for roadside assistance, but discovered that it too was completely dead, despite having been fully charged just 15 minutes earlier when I had checked my delivery schedule. Feeling increasingly bewildered by the cascade of inexplicable equipment failures, I decided to wait in my truck and hoped that another vehicle would pass by so I could flag down help. While waiting, I reached for my coffee cup, expecting to find the hot beverage I had just brewed. but discovered that it had become ice cold, as if it had been sitting in a refrigerator for hours rather than being freshly prepared just moments before. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. A few days ago, my uncle, who makes his living as a professional truck driver navigating the challenging mountainous regions of the Himalayas, shared with me a recent experience that left him deeply unsettled and searching for rational explanations. His work requires him to transport goods through some of the most treacherous and isolated terrain in the world, where the combination of extreme altitude, unpredictable weather, and narrow mountain roads creates constant challenges that test both his driving skills and his mental fortitude. This particular incident occurred at the end of what had been an exceptionally long and demanding day of driving through winding mountain passes and steep gradients that pushed both his truck and his endurance to their limits. As darkness began to fall across the mountain landscape, he made his way to a parking area that served as an overnight rest stop for commercial drivers. Though calling it a proper parking lot would be generous given its lack of adequate lighting in many sections, the facility was barely more than a cleared area of ground with minimal infrastructure, and navigating it safely at night presented significant challenges even for experienced drivers familiar with the location. When midnight arrived, he parked his truck in what seemed like a reasonable spot and contacted his colleague to inquire about the availability of sleeping accommodations in the nearby building that served as makeshift lodging for drivers. His friend informed him that there was indeed space available, but it was in the room that my uncle particularly disliked, the one with the uncomfortably small bed that made restful sleep nearly impossible. After weighing his options, he decided that sleeping in his truck would be preferable to spending the night cramped in that inadequate room. So he declined the offer and settled into his driver's seat to prepare for what he hoped would be a peaceful night's rest. Despite his physical exhaustion from the day's demanding driving, he found himself unable to fall asleep, experiencing an unusual and persistent urge to remain awake and alert. This feeling was completely foreign to him, as he typically had no trouble sleeping after long days on the road. The sensation was so strong and inexplicable that he decided to give in to it rather than fight against his instincts. He retrieved his phone and began scrolling through social media, watching Instagram Reels and YouTube videos to pass the time until sleep would naturally overtake him. This activity continued for approximately 3 hours, during which time he remained wide awake despite his body's obvious need for rest. When he finally checked the time on his phone, he discovered it was 2:48 in the morning. By this point, his eyes had become watery and heavy from staring at the small screen in the darkness for such an extended period, and he was definitely beyond tired. The physical strain of focusing on the bright screen while sitting in complete darkness had created a burning sensation in his eyes that made continued use of the device uncomfortable and impractical. He finally decided to put away his phone and allow sleep to claim him, closing his eyes and settling back into his seat with the expectation that exhaustion would quickly carry him off to dreamland. However, after only a few minutes of rest, he was startled by what he described as the heaviest, most powerful thump he had ever experienced in his entire life. The sound was so intense and overwhelming that he could feel it reverberating through his entire body, like standing too close to massive speakers during a bass-heavy musical performance. Yet, despite its incredible power and volume, the sound had an estranged quality that made it seem as though it was emanating from a great distance, somehow maintaining its earth-shaking intensity while simultaneously feeling remote and otherworldly. His initial attempt to rationalize the experience led him to conclude that, perhaps, someone was loading or unloading heavy cargo from their truck nearby, causing equipment or materials to fall and create the massive impact sound. While this explanation seemed somewhat inadequate given the extraordinary nature of what he had heard, it provided enough comfort to allow him to settle back and attempt to resume his efforts to fall asleep. However, his peace was short-lived, as approximately 30 seconds later, he was again startled by the exact same type of powerful thump that seemed to shake the very foundation of reality around him. This second occurrence forced him to sit bolt upright in his seat, his heart racing as he tried to make sense of what was happening. The thumping sounds continued with increasing frequency, and it didn't take him long to realize that these were not random impacts from cargo handling, but rather the deliberate, rhythmic footsteps of something enormous moving through the parking area. The sounds had a cadence and pattern that unmistakably belonged to a massive creature walking with purpose, each step creating vibrations that traveled through the ground and into his truck. As the footsteps drew closer to his location, the security alarms of nearby trucks began activating in sequence, perfectly synchronized with each thunderous step. The electronic warning systems created a cacophony of beeping and honking that echoed across the mountain parking area, providing an audio map of the creature's movement as it progressed through the lot. Despite his growing terror, my uncle peered through his windshield, desperately trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was creating this disturbance. The darkness was nearly complete, with only minimal ambient light filtering down from the distant stars above the mountain peaks. He could see nothing moving in the blackness ahead, though the sounds continued to grow closer and more intimidating with each passing moment. Finally, desperation overcame his fear, and he reached for the headlight switch, flooding the area in front of his truck with bright illumination. The moment the lights activated, something massive launched itself straight up into the air with lightning-fast speed, disappearing from view so quickly that he could barely process what he had witnessed. The sudden movement created an enormous gust of wind that sent dried leaves and debris swirling in every direction. Even from inside his sealed truck cab, he could hear the powerful sound of massive wings beating against the mountain air, creating rhythmic whooshing noises that spoke of incredible size and strength. After approximately 10 seconds of this aerial display, the creature landed somewhere to the left of his truck, still hidden by the darkness but clearly present and aware of his location. By this point, my uncle was convinced that his life was in immediate danger from whatever supernatural entity had chosen to visit the parking area that night. With trembling hands, he grabbed his flashlight from the small storage compartment on his dashboard and directed its beam toward the area where he believed the creature had landed. Through either incredible fortune or misfortune, the flashlight beam landed directly on the face of the most terrifying creature he had ever encountered. The being's eyes reflected the light with an intense red glow that seemed to burn with malevolent intelligence. Its face had human-like characteristics, but was covered in fur that appeared white as fresh snow, creating a stark and unsettling contrast with its glowing red eyes. The creature seemed to sense his terror and responded by releasing a sound that combined the worst elements of a screech and a growl, creating what he described as the most god-awful noise his ears had ever been subjected to. The expression on its face suggested that it was grinning at him with obvious, malicious intent, displaying rows of extremely sharp, small teeth while appearing to completely lack a nose in the traditional sense. When he shifted his flashlight beam to examine the creature's wings, he encountered what he later described as pure nightmare fuel. Unlike the fur-covered body, the wings were bright red, with every vein clearly visible through what appeared to be translucent skin. The intricate network of blood vessels created a disturbing pattern that seemed to pulse with the creature's heartbeat, making the wings appear almost alive, independent of the rest of its body. After what felt like an eternity of mutual observation, the creature finally began to move away, each step once again triggering the security alarms of nearby trucks as it departed. My uncle waited until the footsteps became nearly inaudible before starting his engine and driving away from the area at speeds that were probably dangerous given the winding mountain roads, but which felt absolutely necessary given the circumstances. He attempted to contact his friend to report the incident, but discovered that his phone battery had died during his earlier social media session, leaving him unable to communicate with anyone about his terrifying encounter. To this day, he remains convinced that whatever he encountered that night was not of this world, radiating an aura of darkness and negativity, unlike anything he had ever experienced in his many years of driving through remote and isolated areas. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. I have been working as a professional truck driver since I turned 21 years old, originally planning to attend college before family financial difficulties forced me to seek immediate employment instead of pursuing higher education. My uncle, who had spent many years as a long-haul trucker, was kind enough to refer me to his company. The transition into professional trucking proved to be more challenging than I had initially anticipated. The process required passing comprehensive written examinations, completing extensive classroom training, and demonstrating practical driving skills under the supervision of experienced instructors. The entire certification process took approximately 4 months of dedicated study and practice before I was qualified to begin working as an official commercial driver. Once I obtained my commercial driver's license, I threw myself into the work with tremendous enthusiasm, accepting assignments that took me to small towns, major cities, and industrial facilities throughout the region. My typical responsibilities involved delivering partial loads to various companies, often requiring multiple stops per trip and careful coordination with receiving personnel at each destination. As I gained experience and established a reputation for reliability and professionalism, I was eventually offered the opportunity to undertake a long-distance assignment to Seattle, Washington. This represented a significant step up in terms of both responsibility and potential earnings, though it also meant spending considerably more time away from home and family. The journey to Seattle required approximately 1 week of travel time, pushing both my endurance and my truck to their limits as I navigated through multiple states and varied terrain conditions. Despite the challenges involved, I managed to complete the delivery within the specified time frame, successfully transporting the goods to their destination and completing all necessary paperwork. After finishing the delivery process, I found myself feeling extremely tired from the extended period of driving and concentration required for such a long-distance assignment. Some of the employees at the Seattle facility recommended a small motel where I could rest before beginning the return journey, suggesting it was a clean and affordable option that catered to commercial drivers. When I arrived at the recommended motel, I discovered that most of the available rooms were already occupied by other travelers, leaving only room 1201 available for rent. I wasn't particularly concerned about the specific room assignment, as my primary need was simply a clean, quiet place where I could get adequate rest before resuming my travels. The motel manager provided me with the standard information about facility rules and policies, though most of the details didn't register clearly in my exhausted state. However, one piece of information did stick in my memory. He mentioned that any room number containing the digit 9 was designated as a maintenance room and should not be disturbed. I accepted the room key and made my way to my assigned accommodation, where I immediately collapsed onto the bed and fell into a deep sleep that lasted several hours. When I awakened around 1 o'clock in the morning, I discovered that the air conditioning unit in my room had malfunctioned and was no longer providing cool air, making the room uncomfortably warm and stuffy. I attempted to resolve the problem myself by adjusting various controls and checking for obvious issues. But my limited knowledge of air conditioning systems proved inadequate for diagnosing and repairing the malfunction. Frustrated by the uncomfortable temperature and my inability to fix the problem, I decided to call the main desk to request maintenance assistance. Unfortunately, no one answered the phone despite multiple attempts to reach the front desk staff. Remembering the manager's earlier comment about maintenance rooms, I decided to venture outside and look for room 12-9, which should have housed the maintenance personnel according to the numbering system he had described. I could see that the lights were on in room 12-0-9, suggesting that someone was indeed present and potentially available to assist with my air conditioning problem. I approached the door and called out politely, explaining that I was staying in room 1201 and needed help with a malfunctioning air conditioning unit. Initially, there was no response to my request, so I waited patiently for several moments before trying again. Finally, a woman's voice replied from within the room, and she emerged halfway through the doorway to speak with me. She apologized for the delay and explained that she was currently busy with other tasks, but assured me that she would be able to assist me shortly. I thanked her for her willingness to help and began walking back toward my room, but then realized that I had forgotten to provide her with my specific room number. I returned to room 1209 and called out again, this time specifying that I needed assistance in room 1201. The same woman emerged from the room again, positioning herself halfway through the doorway exactly as she had done before. However, her response was identical to her previous statement, word for word, as if she were repeating a pre-recorded message rather than engaging in actual conversation with me. This strange repetition immediately struck me as unusual and somewhat unsettling, but I initially attributed it to fatigue or inattention on her part. When I attempted to provide additional information or ask clarifying questions, she once again retreated into the room and then reappeared with the exact same response, delivered in precisely the same manner and tone. The mechanical nature of her responses became increasingly disturbing as the pattern repeated several more times, with her appearing at the doorway and delivering the identical message, regardless of what I said or asked. It became clear that something was fundamentally wrong with this interaction, though I couldn't immediately identify what was causing such bizarre behavior. Growing increasingly uncomfortable with the situation and beginning to question my own sanity, I decided that discretion was the better part of valor. I quickly gathered all of my belongings from room 1201 and made a hasty exit from the motel, preferring to spend the remainder of the night in my truck rather than staying in a facility where such inexplicable events were occurring. let's dive into the next disturbing story. I'm not a professional truck driver myself, but my father has spent many years in the industry, and I'd like to share two of his most memorable and unsettling experiences from his time on the road. These incidents occurred during different periods of his career, but both left lasting impressions that he would carry with him for years afterward. I'll relate these stories from his perspective, as he told them to me during our conversations about his working experiences. The first incident occurred one night when he was retrieving his truck from the commercial yard where he typically stored it between assignments. The facility was located in a somewhat isolated area, surrounded by residential neighborhoods, but set apart from the main commercial districts. It was approaching midnight when he arrived to collect his vehicle for an early morning departure. As he stepped out of his personal car to open the security gate that protected the truck yard, he immediately noticed two disturbing phenomena that caused the hair on the back of his neck to stand up in alarm. The first was an incredibly strong and offensive odor that seemed to permeate the entire area, resembling the smell of rotting flesh, but somehow much worse and more penetrating than anything he had ever encountered before. The second unsettling observation was that every dog in the surrounding neighborhood had begun barking frantically, creating a cacophony of animal distress that echoed through the night air. The intensity and unanimity of their reaction suggested that they were responding to something far more threatening than a simple human presence, and their obvious agitation added to the growing sense of dread that was settling over the area. My father considered himself to be a person who didn't frighten easily, having dealt with numerous challenging situations throughout his life and career. However, the combination of the horrible smell and the dog's hysterical reaction created an overwhelming feeling of pure terror that seemed to emanate from some primal part of his consciousness, warning him that he was in the presence of something genuinely dangerous. Acting on these powerful instincts, he quickly opened the gate and drove through without taking time for his usual careful inspection of the premises. He parked his personal car next to his truck and rapidly gathered all of his necessary belongings, eager to get inside the relative safety of his truck cab as quickly as possible. The feeling of dread continued to intensify with each passing second, making every moment spent in the open feel like an invitation to disaster. He locked his car securely and climbed into his truck with unusual haste, not bothering to properly close and secure the yard gate as he normally would have done. His primary concern at that moment was simply getting away from whatever malevolent presence seemed to be lurking in the darkness around the facility. Later that day, he contacted the woman who owned the yard to apologize for leaving the gate open, explaining that he had been in an unusual hurry and had forgotten to secure it properly. To his surprise, she was completely understanding about the oversight and mentioned that she had also awakened during the night when he arrived, noticing both the strange smell and the dog's unusual behavior. She admitted that she had experienced the same overwhelming sense of dread and fear that had affected him, making it impossible for her to investigate the disturbance or even look outside to see what might be causing such a reaction. Her confirmation that the experience had been shared rather than imagined provided some comfort, but also reinforced his conviction that something genuinely supernatural had been present that night. To this day, my father remains convinced that he encountered what could only have been the devil himself during those terrifying moments in the truck yard. While he acknowledges that this explanation might sound fantastical to skeptical listeners, he cannot think of any other force or entity that could have created such an intense atmosphere of evil and malevolence. The second incident took place in California, where my father had been driving throughout the day and was in desperate need of rest. He had been pushing himself to maintain his delivery schedule, but fatigue was beginning to compromise his safety and judgment, making it necessary to find a suitable place to pull over and get some much-needed sleep. The closest available rest area was the Wesley Rest Stop, located along Interstate 5, a facility that he had used before during previous trips through the region. He pulled into the rest area, found an appropriate parking space for his truck, and began preparing for what he hoped would be several hours of restorative sleep. His pre-sleep routine always included ensuring that his radio was completely turned off, as he found any ambient noise or unexpected sounds to be disruptive to his rest. The radio in his truck was an older model with a physical dial that required a distinctive clicking sound to confirm that it had been properly shut off. He made certain to hear this click before settling down for the night,